If you had told me 6 years ago that my ex-husband would show up on my porch, holding a folder with a $2 million offer to take our son away from me forever, I would have laughed in your face. But that's exactly what happened on a Tuesday evening in October, and by the time he left my house that night, I was the one holding all the power, even though he didn't know it yet. Let me back up. My name is Sarah, and I live in a modest 3-bedroom house on Maple Grove Lane, just outside Columbus, Ohio. It's the kind of house with a crooked mailbox and a front porch swing that needs oiling, the kind of house you buy when you're a single mother trying to make ends meet on a nurse's salary. It's not fancy, but it's home. It's where my son Peter has grown up, where he learned to ride his bike in the driveway, where he did his multiplication tables at the kitchen table every night after school. Peter is 11 now, sandy brown hair, gap-toothed grin, obsessed with dinosaurs, and more recently baseball. He's a good kid. A kind kid. And for the last 6 years, it's mostly been just the two of us. Daniel, my ex-husband, hasn't exactly been what you'd call present. Oh, he pays his child support. The court makes sure of that, but showing up, actually being there. That's another story. He missed Peter's 8th birthday because of a work conflict. He missed the school play in 3rd grade. He missed 2 Christmases entirely, every time there was an excuse. Every time I was the one wiping Peter's tears and telling him his dad loved him, even when I wasn't sure I believed it myself anymore. So when I heard the knock on my door that Tuesday evening and opened it to find Daniel standing there in his expensive wool coat next to a woman I'd never met, my stomach dropped straight to my shoes. "Sarah," he said, like we were old colleagues instead of 2 people who used to share a bed and a life. "This is Claire, my wife." Claire was beautiful in that polished magazine cover way, perfectly highlighted hair, a camel-colored coat that probably cost more than my car payment. But there was something in her eyes that didn't match the rest of her. She looked nervous, almost sick to her stomach. She gave me a small, tight smile and said, "It's nice to finally meet you," in a voice that didn't sound like she meant it was nice at all. I didn't invite them in right away. I just stood there blocking the doorway, waiting for Daniel to explain why he'd driven 40 minutes from his gated community in Dublin to my little house in the middle of a Tuesday. "Can we talk?" he asked. "It's important." Against my better judgment, I let them in. Peter was upstairs doing homework, and I was grateful for that small mercy. Whatever this was, I didn't want him hearing it, not yet. We sat at my dining table, the one with the water ring that never quite came out, no matter how much I scrubbed it. Daniel set his leather briefcase down and pulled out a manila folder. He slid it across the table toward me like he was closing a business deal. "What is this?" I asked, though something in my gut already knew. "Open it," he said. Inside were legal documents. A custody modification agreement drawn up by what looked like an extremely expensive law firm, and clipped to the front a cashier's check. $2 million. I stared at the number so long the zeros started to blur together. "Daniel," I said slowly, "what is this supposed to be?" He leaned forward, his hands folded like he was about to deliver good news. "Sarah, I want full custody of Peter. I'm prepared to sign over that check the moment we finalize it. Claire and I have talked about it extensively. We think Peter deserves..." "Deserves what?" I snapped, cutting him off. "A father who shows up every other Christmas?" Claire flinched at that. "Daniel didn't. He deserves a complete family," Daniel said like he was reciting a line he'd rehearsed in the car. "Private school, a bigger house, 2 parents who are present every single day, college paid for, no loans, no struggle. Claire and I have tried for years to have children of our own. The fertility treatments, they haven't worked. We've decided that Peter is meant to be that child for us." I sat there absorbing every word, and something strange happened. I wasn't angry, not the way you'd expect. Instead, a strange, quiet calm settled over me like the eye of a storm, because I knew something Daniel didn't, something his own mother had sworn to remind him of one day if he ever forgot it. I didn't argue, I didn't raise my voice, I didn't even ask for more time to think it over. I picked up the pen sitting on top of the folder and I signed. Daniel's mouth actually fell open. Claire looked at me like she couldn't decide whether to be relieved or horrified. "That's it?" Daniel asked. "You're not going to fight this?" "No," I said quietly, sliding the papers back to him. "Take good care of him." They left a few minutes later, Daniel practically floating with disbelief at how easy it had all been. I stood on the porch and watched their black SUV pull out of my driveway taillights, disappearing down Maple Grove Lane, carrying my son toward a life I no longer controlled. Daniel thought my calm meant surrender. He had no idea it meant something else entirely. As I stood there in the cold October air, I whispered the only words that mattered to me in that moment. It's finally time. Because 6 years ago I made a promise to a woman who loved her son more than her own pride, and that promise was about to come due. To understand why I signed those papers without so much as a raised voice, you have to go back 11 years to a time before Peter existed, before the divorce, before any of this ever started. Daniel and I got married young. I was 24, he was 26, and like most young couples, we assumed things would go according to plan. We'd get married, buy a starter home, have a couple of kids, build a life. For the first 2 years, that's exactly how it looked from the outside. What nobody saw was the quiet grief happening behind closed doors. We tried for almost 3 years to get pregnant. Nothing worked. Doctor after doctor, test after test, until finally a fertility specialist in Columbus sat us down in his office and delivered the news that would change everything. Daniel. Dr. Reyes said gently, sliding a folder across his desk, much like Daniel would later slide one across mine. Your sperm analysis shows a severe deficiency. Essentially a 0 count. Natural conception isn't going to be possible. I remember reaching for Daniel's hand in that office. He didn't take it. He just stared at the wall like the doctor had told him he had 6 months to live. Daniel didn't handle it well, at all. For a man who had built his entire identity around being strong, capable, the provider infertility didn't feel like a medical diagnosis to him. It felt like a verdict on his manhood. He stopped talking about it, stopped talking to me some days. He'd come home from work, eat dinner in silence, and disappear into the garage for hours, tinkering with nothing in particular. He was ashamed, though he never once said the word out loud. Dr. Reyes had mentioned other options that day, adoption or anonymous donor insemination, but Daniel had shut down so completely that we left without discussing any of it. I didn't push. I loved him, and I could see he was drowning. Months passed. We barely spoke about having children at all. I started to wonder if we ever would. Then one evening, out of nowhere, Daniel came home and asked me to sit down at the kitchen table, the same kitchen table, actually, that would later hold that folder with $2 million sitting on top of it. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice low and unsteady, "about what the doctor said, about the donor option." I held my breath. "I don't want to lose you," he admitted, "and I don't want us to lose the chance to be parents. So if you're willing, I want to try it, the donor insemination." I cried that night, not because I was sad, but because I finally saw a path forward for us. Daniel agreed to move forward with an anonymous sperm donor through the same clinic. He signed every legal document himself, consent forms, establishing him as the legal father, waivers acknowledging the donor would have no parental rights, everything. It was his decision, made with his own hand, his own signature, fully understanding what it meant. But he made one condition, and he made it very clear. "Nobody can ever know," he said. "Not my parents, not our families, not even the child when he's old enough to understand. As far as the world is concerned, this baby is mine, completely mine." I agreed because I understood at the time how fragile his pride was, and because I loved him enough to protect it. We told no one. Not my sister, not our closest friends. The only person Daniel eventually broke down and confided in during a moment of guilt and vulnerability about a year into the process was his own mother, Margaret. Margaret took the secret and held it exactly the way you'd expect a devoted grandmother to hold something so delicate. She never brought it up, never treated Peter any differently once he was born. If anything, she loved him more fiercely because she understood what it had taken to bring him into the world. Peter arrived on a snowy February morning, and I have never seen a man cry the way Daniel cried in that hospital room, holding his son for the first time. Biology or not, in that moment, he was completely, undeniably a father. I believed foolishly that whatever insecurity had haunted him before was finally healed. For a few years it was. We were happy. Daniel coached Peter's t-ball team. He read him bedtime stories. He was in every way that mattered a real father. Then things started to change. Daniel's job took him traveling more. He grew distant first from me and then slowly from Peter too. I found out about Claire almost 2 years before the divorce was finalized. A co-worker at his firm, someone who made him feel, in his words, like a whole man again. I don't know exactly what that meant to him, and honestly by that point I didn't care to ask. During the divorce proceedings, Daniel insisted Peter stay primarily with me. He said he needed space to figure things out. What that space turned into was a slow, steady disappearance from his son's life. Skipped visits, missed calls, birthdays acknowledged with a check instead of a phone call. Only one voicemail from those years has stayed with me word for word all this time. It came from Margaret about a year after the divorce, when she'd noticed how absent Daniel had become. "Sarah," her voice said, soft but resolute, "promise me something. If Daniel ever forgets what truly makes someone a father, if he ever lets pride and distance make him forget what he chose, what he signed, what he became the day he held that baby, promise me I'll be the one to remind him." I promised her I would let her have that chance whenever it came. I just never imagined it would come wrapped in a folder with a $2 million check on top of it. Peter moved into Daniel's house on a Saturday morning, and I remember standing in the driveway of my own home, watching him load his suitcase into the trunk of Daniel's Range Rover, feeling like someone had reached into my chest and hollowed it out. But I had made a decision, and I was going to see it through. I hugged Peter tight, told him I loved him, and told him to call me whenever he wanted, day or night. He looked confused more than anything, an 11-year-old boy trying to understand why his mother wasn't fighting to keep him. "You're really okay with this?" he asked me quietly, his voice small. "I love you more than anything in this world," I told him. "And sometimes love means trusting that things will work out the way they're supposed to." He didn't fully understand what I meant. I wasn't sure I fully understood it myself. But I kissed his forehead and watched the car pull away, and I went back inside my quiet, empty house and waited. Daniel and Claire lived in a beautiful colonial-style home in Dublin, one of those upscale suburbs with manicured lawns and stone mailboxes. From what Peter told me during our phone calls that first week, Claire had gone all out preparing for him. She'd repainted his bedroom a deep forest green because he'd mentioned once in passing that it was his favorite color. She'd stocked the pantry with his favorite cereal and snacks. She even bought a telescope because Peter had gone through a brief phase of being obsessed with astronomy 2 years earlier, a detail I was surprised Daniel had even remembered to mention to her. Claire was trying, genuinely, earnestly trying. I could hear it in Peter's voice when he talked about her. "She's actually pretty nice, Mom," he admitted during one call. "She made me pancakes shaped like dinosaurs, like actual Stegosaurus pancakes." But Daniel was another story entirely. Within days, the man who'd barely enforced a bedtime in 11 years suddenly had a strict schedule taped to the refrigerator. Wake up at 6:30, breakfast by 7, homework immediately after school, no exceptions. Screen time limited to 30 minutes on weekdays. It wasn't parenting so much as it was project management, and Peter, who had grown up with warmth and flexibility, started to shrink under the weight of it. He keeps saying things like, "This is how it's going to be now that we're a real family." Peter told me one night, his voice tight in a way that broke my heart, "But Mom, it doesn't feel like a family. It feels like a job." I told him to be patient, that adjustments take time, even though every instinct in me wanted to drive over there and bring him home immediately. About 10 days after Peter moved in, Margaret came to visit. I found out what happened next, only afterward pieced together from what Peter told me, and later what Margaret herself confided to me over the phone, her voice trembling in a way I'd never heard from her before. Margaret arrived at Daniel's house with a homemade apple pie, the same recipe she'd been making since Daniel was a boy. Peter ran to greet her the moment she walked through the door, throwing his arms around her waist. She hugged him back tightly, kissed the top of his head, and told him how much she'd missed him. It was while she was setting the pie down in the kitchen that she noticed the new photographs. Claire had commissioned a professional photographer for a family portrait session just days after Peter arrived. The three of them dressed in matching neutral tones posed against a soft gray backdrop, smiling the practiced smiles of people trying very hard to convince themselves of something. The photos were framed and hung prominently in the hallway, and beneath the largest one in elegant gold script, Claire had commissioned a custom plaque. "Our perfect family." Margaret stood there staring at it for a long moment. Daniel walked in behind her, beaming with a kind of pride Margaret hadn't seen from him in years. He gestured toward the photographs, like he was unveiling a piece of art. "What do you think, Mom?" he asked. "Finally, we have the son we always deserved. A real family complete the way it should have been from the start." Margaret felt something cold settle in her chest. "Peter," she called gently, "would you mind going outside for a bit? I saw a swing set in the backyard. Go try it out for me." Peter, sensing nothing unusual, happily ran off toward the sliding glass door. Once he was gone, Margaret turned back to her son. Her face had gone pale, the color drained from her cheeks entirely. "Daniel," she said slowly, carefully, like she was testing the weight of every word before she said it. "What exactly do you mean the son you deserved? You already had a son who loved you unconditionally for 11 years. Daniel frowned, confusion flickering across his face. "Mom, you know what I mean. Peter's finally part of a real complete family unit now. 2 parents present every day the way it should have always been." "That's not what I'm asking," Margaret said, her voice barely above a whisper now. "I'm asking if you understand what you're actually saying, if you remember." "Remember what?" Daniel asked, his frown deepening. Margaret closed her eyes for a moment, gathering herself. "Wait," she said quietly. "Sarah never told you. Did she? Told me what?" Daniel demanded, his patience thinning. "Mom, you're not making any sense." Margaret looked at her son. This man she had raised, this man who was about to learn something that would unravel everything he thought he understood about his own life, and realized with a growing sense of horror that he truly had no idea. He didn't remember. Or perhaps in all these years of pride and distance, he had simply never let himself fully understand what he had agreed to that day in the fertility clinic all those years ago. "Sit down, Daniel," she said softly. "There's something you need to know. Something I promised Sarah I would tell you if the day ever came that you forgot what truly made you Peter's father." Part 3. The Homecoming. 1041. Words continue. Pivoted toward subsequent section. Progression pivoted toward subsequent section. Progression Part 4. Everything falls apart. Daniel sat down slowly at his own kitchen table, the same kind of table where, years earlier, a doctor's office folder had once changed the course of his life, and where more recently he'd slid a folder of his own across to me. He had no idea he was about to sit through a conversation that would undo everything he thought he understood about himself. Margaret took a deep breath and began. She reminded him gently at first of the fertility clinic, of Dr. Reyes, of the diagnosis that had devastated him at 29 years old. She watched his face as the memories surfaced, memories he had spent over a decade trying to bury so deep he'd nearly convinced himself they belonged to someone else. "You remember all of that?" Margaret said carefully. "Don't you?" Daniel's jaw tightened. "Of course I remember. What does that have to do with anything now? Do you remember what you decided to do about it?" Margaret asked. "The donor program, the forms you signed." Something shifted in Daniel's expression, a flicker of recognition trying to fight its way through years of denial and willful forgetting. That was just a medical procedure, a technicality. Peter is my son. I raised him. I was there for his birth. Peter is not biologically your son, Daniel." Margaret said, her voice steady, even as tears welled in her eyes. "He was conceived using an anonymous donor because you couldn't conceive naturally. You knew this. You agreed to it. You signed the consent forms yourself in your own handwriting, becoming his legal father by choice, not by biology." The kitchen went completely silent. Claire, who had been standing in the doorway listening unnoticed, made a small strangled sound. "What?" she whispered. "Daniel, is that true?" Daniel's face had gone white. "No," he said, shaking his head slowly, almost violently. "No, that's not. There must be some mistake. The clinic must have made an error. That's not possible." "It's not a mistake," Margaret said quietly. "I have the records. Sarah gave me copies years ago in case something like this ever happened. I kept them safe just as I promised her I would." She pulled a folder from her purse, a folder far less glamorous than the one Daniel had presented to me days earlier, but infinitely more consequential. Inside were the original consent documents from the fertility clinic, complete with Daniel's own signature on every page, dated 11 years earlier. Daniel stared at his own handwriting like it belonged to a stranger. "I don't understand," he said, his voice cracking. "Why would I agree to this? Why would I forget something like this?" "Because you didn't want to remember," Margaret said, not unkindly, but firmly. "Because admitting it meant admitting something about yourself you couldn't accept. So you buried it. You told yourself Peter was yours in every sense, and for a while that was true in the ways that actually mattered. But somewhere along the way you let your pride convince you that biology was the missing piece, that a complete family meant something measured in DNA instead of love." Claire sank into a nearby chair, her hands trembling. "All this time," she said softly, almost to herself, I thought we were trying to build something Daniel already had once, something he lost because of me, because of the affair. I never imagined—" She couldn't finish the sentence. Daniel put his head in his hands. For a long moment nobody spoke. The framed photograph in the hallway, our perfect family, suddenly felt like a cruel joke hanging on the wall for everyone to see. "I abandoned him," Daniel said finally, his voice barely audible. "Not because he wasn't really mine. I abandoned him because I stopped acting like his father a long time before I ever found out any of this. This whole time I thought I was giving him a better life by bringing him here. But I wasn't doing it for him. I was doing it to prove something to myself." Margaret reached across the table and took her son's hand. "Then it's not too late to prove something different," she said. "But you need to fix this. Now, before it's too late." That's when they realized the sliding glass door to the backyard was standing wide open. Peter was gone. He had come back inside sometime during the conversation. Nobody could say exactly when to grab a water bottle from the kitchen, and he had heard enough fragments, enough words like "not really his" and "donor" and "mistake" to send an 11-year-old boy's entire understanding of his own identity crashing down around him. He had slipped out the front door without anyone noticing, and by the time Claire realized his shoes were missing from the entryway, he could have been anywhere. Daniel's phone was already in his hand, dialing my number with shaking fingers, when Claire grabbed her keys and ran for the car. Margaret stood frozen in the kitchen, staring at the framed photograph on the wall, the plaque beneath it suddenly reading like an epitaph for a family that had never really understood what it meant to be whole. My phone rang 40 minutes after Peter first walked out that door. "Sarah," Daniel said, his voice breaking in a way I had never heard before in all the years I'd known him. "Peter's gone. I don't know where he is. Please, I need your help. I don't know what to do." For the first time in 6 years, Daniel sounded like a father who was truly afraid of losing his son. Not because of a custody agreement, not because of pride, because he finally understood what he stood to lose. I don't remember driving to Dublin that night. I remember gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles turned white, and I remember praying, actual desperate praying, the kind I hadn't done since Peter was born 6 weeks premature, and we didn't know if he'd make it through his first night. But somewhere between my house and Daniel's muscle memory took over, because the next clear thing I remember is pulling into his driveway and seeing Daniel standing outside, phone still in his hand, looking like a man who had aged 10 years in the span of an hour. "Have you called the police?" I asked, jumping out of my car before I'd even put it in park. "They're on their way," he said. Sarah, I am so sorry. I don't know how this happened. I don't know how he heard, "Where's Claire?" driving around the neighborhood. Margaret's checking the park near the elementary school. I closed my eyes and forced myself to think like Peter, not like a panicked mother. Where would an 11-year-old boy go if his entire world had just been turned upside down somewhere familiar, somewhere that felt safe, somewhere that reminded him of who he was before any of this? And then it hit me. "The community baseball field," I said. "On Route 9, where you used to coach his t-ball team." Daniel looked at me confused for a moment, and then something clicked behind his eyes. A memory of simpler years, sunny Saturday mornings, a much smaller Peter in an oversized batting helmet grinning up at him from home plate. We took my car. Neither of us spoke during the 15-minute drive, the silence thick with everything neither of us knew how to say yet. When we pulled into the gravel parking lot, the field lights were off, the diamond bathed only in the dim orange glow of a single street lamp near the dugout. And there, sitting alone on the bleachers behind home plate, was Peter. I have never felt relief like that in my entire life. I was out of the car before it had fully stopped running across the gravel calling his name. Peter looked up, his face streaked with tears, and for a moment I thought he might run again. Instead, he just sat there, small and shaking, hugging his knees to his chest. I reached him first and pulled him into my arms, and he sobbed into my shoulder the way he hadn't since he was much younger. Daniel hung back a few steps, uncertain, his hands shoved deep in his coat pockets. "Mom," Peter said between gasping breaths, "is it true? Am I not really his? Was it all a lie?" I held his face in my hands and looked him directly in the eyes. "You are the most real, most loved child in this entire world," I told him. "Nothing about who conceived you changes one single thing about how much you are loved. Not by me, not by your grandmother, and not whether he's shown it well or not by your dad." Peter looked past me toward Daniel, who was standing frozen a few feet away, looking like a man who had no idea what to do with his own hands. "Were you ever really my dad?" Peter asked him directly, his voice small but steady. "Or was I just something you agreed to?" Daniel didn't answer right away. For a long moment he just stood there, and I watched something break open in him, years of buried shame, pride, and fear finally cracking under the weight of his son's question. Then he walked forward and knelt down in the gravel in front of Peter so they were eye level. "I am the man who failed you," Daniel said, his voice raw. "I missed birthdays I can never get back. I let my own fear and pride convince me that something was wrong with our family, when the only thing wrong was how I was showing up for you. But I need you to hear something, and I need you to really hear it. I have loved you since the second I held you in that hospital room 11 years ago. That love never had anything to do with biology. I just forgot somewhere along the way what that love actually required of me." Peter's chin trembled. "Then why did you want to take me away? Why did you offer Mom money for me like I was something you could just buy?" Daniel closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, there were tears on his face too. "Because I thought money and a bigger house could fix something that was actually broken in me," he admitted. "I was wrong. I am so sorry, Peter. I am so sorry." Claire's car pulled into the lot a moment later, and she got out slowly, hanging back, clearly unsure if she belonged in this moment at all. Peter looked over at her, and she took a hesitant step forward. "I owe you an apology too," she said softly, kneeling down near him. "I think I convinced myself that if I just tried hard enough, the right pancakes, the right bedroom color, the right family photo, I could make us a family overnight. But that's not how it works, is it? I let myself believe that comfort and money could replace actually earning your trust. I'm sorry, Peter." Peter looked between the three adults surrounding him, his mother, his father, and the woman trying so hard to become something to him. And for the first time all night, some of the tension in his small shoulders began to ease. We drove back to my house that night, all of us, and sat together in my kitchen until nearly 2 a.m. Margaret joined us not long after, relief written across her face the moment she saw Peter safe on my couch, wrapped in a blanket, finally calm. Nobody argued that night, nobody assigned blame. We simply really talked for the first time in years about what family actually meant and what it was going to take to rebuild something honest from the wreckage of everything that had almost fallen apart. Several months have passed since that night at the baseball field, and if you'd told me back then how things would look now, I don't think I would have believed you. The custody agreement Daniel drew up, the one with the $2 million check clipped to the front of it, was voluntarily torn up within a week. Not because a judge ordered it, not because of any legal battle, but because Daniel showed up at my house one afternoon, sat across from me at that same water-ringed dining table, and asked what I actually thought was best for Peter. I think he should stay primarily with me, I told him honestly. He needs stability right now more than anything, but I think he should also spend real time with you, not because a court says so, because he wants to, and because you're finally showing up for it. Daniel agreed without a moment of hesitation. So that's how it's been. Peter lives with me. During the week sleeps in his own room with the same faded dinosaur curtains he's had since he was 6. Does his homework at the same kitchen table where all of this began. But most weekends he goes to Daniel and Claire's house not out of obligation, but because he genuinely looks forward to it now. Daniel started seeing a therapist shortly after that night, something I honestly never expected from him. He told me once, sitting on my porch swing while we waited for Peter to grab his overnight bag, that the hardest part wasn't learning that Peter wasn't biologically his. It was realizing how much of his life he'd spent measuring his worth by things that never actually mattered: status, image, the appearance of a complete family, instead of simply being present for the people who loved him. Claire has changed too, in ways I genuinely didn't anticipate. She started volunteering with a local support group for couples struggling with infertility, sharing her own story, including the parts that were hardest to admit. She told me once that Peter taught her something she hadn't understood before, that motherhood, real motherhood, isn't something you're handed, or something you can purchase with the right nursery colors and homemade pancakes. It's something you build patiently, honestly, one ordinary Tuesday at a time. Margaret, more than anyone, became the quiet thread holding all of us together. She still makes that same apple pie recipe, and now she brings 2, one for my house, one for Daniel's, because she refuses to let either home feel like the lesser one in Peter's life. She told me recently that keeping that secret for 11 years had weighed on her more than she ever let on, but that she doesn't regret a single day of it, because it gave Daniel and Claire the exact moment they needed to finally understand what family actually meant. Last month, Peter graduated from middle school. I sat in the bleachers of that packed gymnasium, and when I looked down the row, I saw Daniel and Claire sitting together, both of them cheering just as loudly as I was when Peter's name was called. No tension between us, no resentment simmering beneath polite smiles. Just 2 parents, 3 really, counting Claire, who had finally learned the hard way what it actually takes to show up for a child. Afterward, Peter ran over to all of us at once, not sure who to hug first, and ended up just pulling everyone into one big awkward group hug in the middle of the gymnasium floor. I caught Daniel's eye over Peter's shoulder, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, I saw something in his face I hadn't seen in years. Peace. I think about that folder Daniel slid across my table all those months ago more often than I probably should. $2 million meant to buy something that was never actually for sale. Because here's what I've come to understand more deeply than I ever did before all of this happened: children are never prizes to be won, purchased, or claimed. The title of parent isn't handed to you by a birth certificate or a check with enough zeros on it. It's earned quietly and completely, in every ordinary moment you choose to show up. Sometimes the hardest truths in life don't destroy a family. Sometimes they're exactly what a family needs to finally start healing. If this story meant something to you, if it reminded you of your own family, your own struggles, or simply the quiet, everyday ways love gets built rather than bought, I hope you'll take a moment to sit with that feeling. Share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And if you'd like more stories like this one, consider subscribing, because there are more journeys of forgiveness, honesty, and family still to come. Thank you for walking through this one with me.